She was not born to be remembered, not by name, not by title, and certainly not by history. In the dim mosaic of Ottoman power, where concubines were traded like coins and sons were weighed like treasure, Halime began her life not as a queen, but as a vessel, silent, observant, and entirely forgettable. Her beauty may have earned her a place within the harem, but it was her quiet defiance, her steeled gaze beneath a lowered head, that secured her survival. And it would be her cunning, not her kindness, that would shape an empire through the trembling hands of her son. When Mustafa was born, Halime did not weep with joy. She wept in terror. In the Ottoman court, sons were not blessings. They were wagers. A prince could be a path to power or a mark for death. The practice of fratricide, once justified as a necessity for the stability of the realm, meant that no mother slept soundly, no cradle was safe. Halime cradled her infant as one might a candle in a storm, precious, flickering, always in danger of being extinguished by forces beyond reach. The boy grew beneath the shadow of the tulip domes, his childhood muted by protocol and guarded whispers. He rarely laughed, even when other children played near the fountains. He listened, always listened, and Halime, ever vigilant, fed him caution instead of fairy tales. She knew better than to let him believe he was free. Freedom in the palace was a dangerous illusion. What he had was something else entirely, a place in the cafes. The cafes, literally the cage, was the empire's answer to fratricide. No longer would brothers kill brothers, now they would simply be imprisoned silently for life. Introduced as a humane innovation, the cafes was a gilded tomb, cloaked in luxury but steeped in madness. Princes were confined within the palace, surrounded by eunuchs in deafening quiet, denied the world beyond the walls that glittered with calligraphy and paranoia. They were not allowed to rule, nor were they allowed to live. They waited, forgotten until remembered, remembered only when power required a name. Mustafa entered the cafes when he was still a boy. He did not cry, but Halime saw the shift. Something in him retreated, something vital. She watched as he paced in slow circles, counting tiles, whispering names of ancestors he had never met. He began talking to shadows, sometimes to corners, sometimes to no one. The physicians came and left. Their diagnoses were meaningless, couched in the language of imbalance, bile, and celestial misfortune. What none of them admitted, what Halime alone seemed to understand, was that he was being slowly unmade, not by illness, but by design. And yet the wheel of fate turned. In 1617, Sultan Ahmed I died young. He was only 27. His death was sudden, unexplained by any lasting illness, and left a vacuum so vast that even the most seasoned viziers hesitated. For the first time in Ottoman history, the line of succession was not straightforward. Ahmed had sons, but they were all children. The idea of a child sultan, guided by a regency, terrified the court more than the alternative. That alternative was Halime's son, Mustafa, the forgotten prince in the cafes. Halime seized the moment. She had waited in silence for years, playing the role of submissive mother, forgotten widow, shadowed concubine. But now she stepped forward, not into the light, but into the corridors of power. She whispered to the ulama, invoked the tradition of seniority, argued that Mustafa, though imperfect, was the eldest male of the dynasty. She did not deny his condition. She reframed it. He was quiet because he was contemplative. He was reclusive because he was wise. He had seen death up close and therefore valued life. She painted his madness as mysticism, his trembling as divine sensitivity. They believed her, or perhaps they simply feared the chaos of a child ruler. Either way, they crowned Mustafa Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The coronation was muted. No drums thundered, no grand parades graced the streets of Constantinople. It was not a celebration, it was a compromise. The empire had chosen silence over spectacle, hoping that stability might emerge from uncertainty. But as Mustafa ascended the throne, Halime watched from behind the lattice of the harem, her heart thudding like war drums. She had won, and in winning she had unleashed a reign that would be both her triumph and her torment. At first, Mustafa performed the rituals. He visited the tombs, kissed the hands of elders, distributed coins to the poor. But there was a vacancy in his eyes, a tremor in his gestures. He forgot names. He asked strange questions during council meetings. He spoke to long-dead ancestors as if they were present. The court grew uneasy. The janissaries, ever watchful, began murmuring. The Grand Vizier recorded his concerns, coded in delicate language. His Majesty is of a reflective nature. His Majesty communes with the unseen. Halime intervened. She surrounded her son with advisors of her choosing, men who owed their loyalty not to the empire, but to her. She crafted a court within the court, where information flowed through her fingers before reaching his ears. Decisions were signed in his name, but penned by her hand. She thought she could manage it, that a mother's love, when disciplined by ambition, could hold an empire together. But empires are not made of sentiment. They are made of steel, blood, and perception. And the perception was cracking. One morning, Halime was summoned in haste. Mustafa had torn apart a curtain in the imperial chamber and shouted at a wall for over an hour, demanding that his brother rise from the dead. He refused to eat for days. He attempted to throw coins from the palace balcony, insisting the empire no longer needed wealth. The viziers were alarmed. Halime Sultan, ever the strategist, began lobbying for the reinstatement of her son, Ottoman II. Halime doubled down. She dismissed dissenters. She bribed commanders. She reminded the janissaries of their privileges under Mustafa's rule. But the current was shifting. The empire needed a leader, not a symbol, and Mustafa was becoming a liability too great to bear. In 1618, barely a year into his reign, Mustafa was deposed. Halime watched, powerless. As her son was led back into the cafes, his eyes vacant, his hands shaking. No blood was shed. No rebellion rose. The empire simply turned the page, as if he had never existed. But Halime did not grieve. She planned. The story of Mustafa was far from over, and Halime Sultan, now stripped of titles but not of will, was not yet finished. History would soon discover that a sultan could rise again, even from madness, and that the hand guiding him could be invisible, female, and utterly relentless. She withdrew without ceremony, no tears, no outrage, only silence. Halime had learned long ago that power in the harem was not worn on the head, but threaded through the walls. Her chambers became quiet again, stripped of the subtle luxuries that defined a valied sultan's station. The maids avoided her eyes. Eunuchs no longer bowed as low. Her son was no longer sultan, and therefore she was no longer a queen mother. But Halime did not mourn the crown. She mourned what the crown had done to her son. In the cafes, Mustafa resumed the patterns of his former life, though now with a different kind of vacancy. He muttered less, but stared more. There were mornings when he refused to stand, afternoons when he clawed at embroidered pillows like they held serpents. The fire in him, once merely dulled, now flickered on the edge of extinction. Halime visited him often. She brought him books, incense, relics of memory. He did not speak her name. Sometimes he did not recognize her at all. And yet she came day after day, sitting by his side, whispering verses from the Quran, poems from forgotten times, memories of fountains and moonlight when he was still a boy. She did not do this out of mere sentiment. Halime was not a woman ruled by nostalgia. She did it to keep him tethered, to her, to himself, to the slim possibility of return. Outside, the empire shifted. Ottoman II, young and ambitious, began to assert himself. He was different from Mustafa in every way. Brilliant, commanding, full of reformist fire. He hated the janissaries and plotted to curb their power. He planned military campaigns, dreamed of centralization, flirted with foreign alliances. He even attempted to replace the traditional pilgrimage with a symbolic march to the east, hoping to sanctify a military endeavor as a holy rite. But the janissaries, emboldened by decades of unchecked influence, did not take kindly to being restrained. In Osman's youth, his arrogance only deepened their resentment. Whispers of dissent grew into murmurs of rebellion. The palace corridors once again filled with shadows. Halime watched all of this from her dim quarters. She saw the seeds of self-destruction in Osman's reign, and quietly she fed the soil. She made no public moves, but she reconnected with key commanders. She offered assurances, reminded them of past loyalties. She rekindled debts owed to her when she was valid sultan. Slowly, carefully, she built a silent network, one made not of force but of memory, guilt, and favor. Then came the breaking point. In the spring of 1622, Osman Tooth was captured by his own soldiers. In a moment that stunned the empire, the young sultan was dragged into the bowels of Yedikul fortress and murdered, strangled with a bowstring. The killing was brutal, senseless, and unprecedented. Never before had a reigning Ottoman sultan been executed by his own troops. The empire trembled. Constantinople held its breath. There was no plan, no heir apparent, no guiding hand, except for Halime's. The Janissaries, in need of a name, any name, turned to the only surviving adult male of the dynasty. They turned to Mustafa, and behind Mustafa, as always, stood his mother. His second coronation was even quieter than the first. No speeches, no cheers, only the ceremonial recitation of titles, the mechanical act of placing the turban upon his head. The empire had not crowned a leader, it had resurrected a ghost. Halime returned to power. This time she did not pretend. She did not cloak herself in soft diplomacy or whispered suggestions. She governed. Through proxies, yes, but with unmistakable authority. She replaced key viziers, restored loyalists, rewarded the Janissaries handsomely for their support. Her son remained sultan in name, but the empire moved once again to the rhythm of her will, and yet it was not the same. Mustafa was no longer capable of even pretending to rule. He wandered the palace halls at night, clutching prayer beads, mumbling to himself. He called out to Osman's spirit, sometimes weeping, sometimes cursing. On one occasion, he demanded that the executioners be brought to him, not to punish them, but to congratulate them. "They have done what I could not," he said, before collapsing into silence. Halim kept him hidden as much as possible. Official business was conducted through intermediaries. The divan met without his presence. The empire, she thought, could be held together through ritual and inertia. But inertia is not leadership, and ritual does not conquer rebellion. Within months, the cracks returned. Governors in Anatolia refused to obey decrees issued in Mustafa's name. Foreign emissaries sent letters addressed to the true rulers behind the curtain. Trade slowed. Tax collectors were attacked. Rumors spread of the Sultan eating alone, speaking to stones, tearing the hems of his own robes in frustration. And then came the question no mother wants to face. Had she saved her son or condemned him? The walls of the palace had become mirrors. Every reflection showed her face not as she had imagined it, as a queen, a protector, a wise regent, but as something far more fragile, a woman who had tried to wield power not as a sword, but as a mother's embrace, and in doing so, had unleashed something neither strong nor stable, but broken. Halim knew it was ending. She heard the steps in the night, the quiet assembling of guards, the shifting of allegiances, the sigh of inevitability. She had survived too long not to recognize the rhythm of betrayal. In 1623, barely a year into his second reign, Mustafa was deposed again. This time, there was no negotiation, no protest. He was led away silently, as if returning to a place he had never truly left. Halime was confined, stripped of authority but not of breath. She faded from the palace halls, her name spoken only in cautious tones. She was neither executed nor exiled. The empire had learned to fear women like her, not for what they could do, but for what they might still remember. As for Mustafa, he spent the remaining years of his life in the cafes once more. He died in 1639, largely forgotten, without children, without ceremony. But the story of Mustafa is not a tale of a madman. It is a tale of silence used as a weapon, of love twisted into strategy, of a mother who built an empire from the margins, only to watch it reject her son twice. And it is in that rejection, not his madness, that the tragedy truly lies. Because the most haunting sound in the palace of Topkapi was not the scream of a mad sultan. It was the quiet breath of the woman who tried to save him and failed. The death of Sultan Ahmed IV in 1617 shattered more than a dynasty. It ruptured the logic that had held the Ottoman Empire together for nearly 3 centuries. For the first time, the empire faced a question it had long refused to answer. Who would inherit power when the traditions themselves had begun to contradict each other? The rules of succession, once dictated by survival and bloodshed, were now caught in the tangled roots of mercy and uncertainty. Ahmed had left behind multiple sons, children too young to rule, too precious to kill, and too politically dangerous to ignore. And in that space of indecision, in the brief breath between the death of one ruler and the rise of another, the harem whispered. Not with panic, but with calculation. Because in the Ottoman court, delay was just another form of death, and silence another kind of ambition. At the center of that whispering maze stood two women, Halime Sultan, the favorite consort of Ahmed, and Halime Sultan, the forgotten consort of Mehmed III. One had ruled the empire quietly through her husband, and now eyed the future through her sons. The other had been exiled to the edges of palace life, her only child imprisoned in the cafes like a dream left out to rot. But now the court looked not for beauty nor virtue, but for stability. And stability, they believed, lay in age, in seniority, in a prince who had survived the cage. Mustafa. He was not the obvious choice. He was not even the desired one. But he was the only adult male of the House of Osman capable of being crowned. And in the days of Ahmed's funeral, when the empire held its breath and the janissaries awaited a signal, it was Halime who stepped from the shadows. She moved through the palace not like a ghost, but like smoke, unseen yet felt. She called on old alliances. She reminded the Grand Vizier of debts unpaid, of favors granted, of moments long buried beneath silk and incense. She invoked the teachings of the ulama, that the most senior male must inherit the mantle of the prophet's shadow on earth. She painted her son's silence as spiritual, his solitude as wisdom. She argued that the empire needed not a boy king, but a man who had survived the crucible of palace politics without blood on his hands. The council wavered. Kusum pushed back. She had sons, princes of noble birth, of bright eyes and sharp minds, raised in her image. She lobbied for Osman, her eldest. He was only 14, but he was intelligent, commanding, ambitious. He had been groomed for power, unlike the shadow figure pacing in his chamber, speaking to no one. The janissaries, for their part, favored Osman. He was young, moldable, and promised the possibility of fresh conquest. But the ulama did not want war, nor did they want a regency. They feared what might happen if the empire appeared to falter, if a child sultan brought whispers of weakness to the gates of Europe and Persia alike. And so, through sleepless nights and veiled alliances, Halime won. They unlocked the cafes. Mustafa emerged blinking into the golden light of authority. He did not smile. He did not speak. He only stood still, as if waiting for the world to turn away again. His hands shook when the turban was placed on his head. His voice cracked when he recited the opening prayer. But no one dared mention it. The court nodded. The janissaries bowed. The empire turned with a grimace toward continuity. But behind the lattice screens, Kusum watched. She did not rage. She did not weep. Instead, she began the work of erosion. She reached out to commanders left out of the decision. She cultivated alliances with viziers, disillusioned by Mustafa's condition. She whispered rumors to foreign envoys. The empire is unstable. The sultan cannot rule. The mother governs while the son speaks to walls. And the walls, they listened. Mustafa's condition, never stable, began to deteriorate under the weight of the crown. He awoke at night screaming the names of brothers long dead. He refused to dress in royal garments, claiming they whispered curses. He insisted that birds in the palace gardens were spies sent by former sultans. The court physicians prescribed opiates. The imams recommended prayer. The palace guards tightened their rotations. None of it mattered, because Mustafa was not mad by nature. He was mad by design. The cafes had unraveled him long ago. The silence, the fear, the enforced isolation, these were not accidents of royal life. They were instruments. And now those instruments played through his trembling hands and empty gaze. Halime saw it. She knew. And still she clung to him, because she had no other son, no other future, no other weapon in the war for relevance. She shielded him as best she could. She held court in his name, vetted decrees before they reached his eyes, controlled who entered his presence. She tried to create a rhythm, a ritual to keep him grounded. Certain hours for reading, certain rooms for prayer, certain voices to keep him tethered. But the empire could not be ruled by routine, and the court could not pretend forever. The Janissaries grew restless. They had tolerated Mustafa out of necessity, but necessity had given way to chaos. The provinces whispered of rebellion. Tax revenues faltered. Diplomats from Vienna and Safavid Persia sent coded letters describing the empire as headless, wandering, haunted. It was Kosum who moved first. She presented Osman not as a usurper, but as a savior, a prince of promise, educated, eloquent, ready to restore glory. She promised concessions to the military. She offered favors to the court. She lobbied the ulama with theological arguments about youthful vigor and divine will. Halime countered, but the tide was turning. And then, in a meeting of the Imperial Council, the Grand Vizier declared what no one had dared speak aloud. Mustafa was unfit to rule. He was deposed in silence. There were no riots, no banners, only the quiet reactivation of an old cell, the reopening of a familiar door. Mustafa did not resist. He simply walked back into the cafes as if he had never left, his eyes unfocused, his breath shallow, his crown left behind on a silk cushion, forgotten like a broken toy. Halime remained behind. She had gained the throne not through battle, but through the careful arrangement of words and fears. She had lost it in the same way. There was no trial, no sentence, just absence. She watched as Kosum rose, smiling with the softness of a woman who had never killed, yet had buried kings. Osman Tooth ascended the throne. The court exhaled. Halime did not, because power once touched does not let go easily. And though she was no longer Wielded Sultan, she had learned a truth far more dangerous than any decree. Thrones do not belong to the worthy. They belong to the last one standing. And Halime Sultan was not done standing. The quarters of Topkapi had never been quiet, not truly. Even in the dead of night, when torches flickered against tile and eunuchs padded barefoot past sleeping doors, the palace breathed. It exhaled secrets. It hummed with listening walls. And in the weeks after Mustafa was returned to the cafes, it grew more alive than ever, not with celebration, but with surveillance. Whispers moved faster than couriers. They slid under doors, coiled around columns, clung to the hems of robes. The new sultan, Osman Tooth, was a boy in years but a man in vision. He had inherited a fractured empire, and he ruled not by consensus but by calculation. His ascent had been clean, bloodless, but that did not make it secure. And so he watched, especially the shadows where old power still breathed. He watched Halime Sultan. She was no longer Waleed. Her title was stripped, her chambers reduced. She held no formal power, signed no documents, summoned no viziers, but she remained. And for those who knew how empire worked, her presence was louder than a decree. She had crowned a sultan, twice. She had survived a court designed to erase women like her. And now she waited, quiet as ash. Osman feared her, or more precisely, he feared what she represented. A return to a system where mothers governed behind veils, where the harem whispered louder than the council, where janissaries took coin, not orders. So he moved quickly. He reshuffled the court, demoting those who had once knelt before Mustafa. He restricted Halime's access to her son, citing concern for the sultan's mental well-being. He limited her attendance, forbade gatherings, ensured that every message to or from her rooms passed through 3 layers of bureaucracy. He sent his mother Kosum to monitor her, smiling sweetly, cloaked in civility. But walls do not stop whispers. They only change their direction. Halime did not fight Osman openly. That would have been suicide. Instead, she began to listen. She listened to the eunuchs who grumbled about reduced stipends, to the viziers who felt insulted by the boy sultan's reforms, to the janissaries who muttered about broken promises and foreign ambitions. And she listened most closely to her son. Mustafa had changed. The cafes, once a strange quietude, had become his only rhythm. He no longer screamed. He no longer clawed at pillows or cursed dead ancestors. But the madness had not gone. It had merely softened, like a bruise spreading under skin. He spoke to shadows with gentleness now. He sang to himself in broken melodies. Sometimes when Halime was allowed to see him, he would smile at her, not as a son but as a child to a nursemaid. He remembered her face, not her name. He seemed to have floated out of time, but he was alive. And in the empire that was enough, because Osman's reign was unraveling faster than it had begun. His vision, bold and reformist, made enemies in every corner. He tried to discipline the Janissaries, cutting salaries, demanding accountability, planning to replace them with a new army drawn from Anatolian nobility. He insulted their honor. Worse, he underestimated their memory. They remembered the days under Mustafa, chaotic but indulgent. They remembered Halime's subtle generosity, her steady hand beneath the trembling crown. And they remembered being feared. The Janissaries began to plot. Halime did not command them. She did not meet in secret rooms or send agents through tunnels. She merely existed, patient, silent, watching. And when the rebellion came, it was not with her voice, but with her shadow. In May of 1622, the Janissaries rose. They stormed the palace, seized Osman, and dragged him through the streets like a criminal. The boy Sultan was humiliated, beaten, and, against every law of Ottoman custom, executed by strangulation in the bowels of Yedikul fortress. The empire gasped. The world reeled. A sultan murdered by his own guard. It had never happened before, and the throne stood empty once again. The choice this time was no choice at all. The other princes were children. The nobility were fractured. The Janissaries, drunk on victory, demanded a figurehead, and Halime stepped forward, not with a speech, not with a sword, but with a name. Mustafa, again. They brought him out of the cafes. He blinked at the light as if it had changed color. He asked where the birds had gone. He repeated prayers under his breath, but he wore the turban. He ascended the throne. And once again the empire bowed to a man who could barely hold a thought. But this time, there was no illusion. Mustafa did not rule. Halime did. Her second regency was not soft. It was sharp, surgical, pragmatic. She knew now that mercy was a weakness and subtlety a delay. She appointed viziers loyal to her cause. She gave the Janissaries gold, food, promises. She kept her son isolated from decision-making entirely. The empire functioned like a marionette. The strings held tightly in her weathered fingers. But power held this way is never still. Rebellions flared in the provinces. Baghdad threatened mutiny. The Persian border began to shift. In Anatolia, a preacher claimed divine authority and raised a militia. And through it all, the same whisper repeated itself. The Sultan is mad. The mother rules. The empire is bleeding. Halime worked endlessly. She wrote orders late into the night, counseled viziers until her eyes burned, calculated every alliance with the precision of a surgeon. But every solution frayed another thread. Every favor cost another loyalty. She was fighting not just enemies, but exhaustion, isolation, time. And then came the moment she had dreaded most. Mustafa began to speak of Osman again. He wandered the gardens, speaking to fountains. He called for the executioners, not to punish, but to congratulate. He claimed he had seen Osman's ghost by the old well. He laughed at shadows. And one morning he tried to climb onto the roof of the palace, convinced that the birds would carry him to heaven. The viziers could no longer pretend, nor could the Janissaries. Halime was summoned, her authority questioned, her sanity doubted. She begged for time. She offered to abdicate on Mustafa's behalf. But the empire did not need negotiation. It needed erasure. Mustafa was deposed again. Halime was confined to her quarters. The empire turned to a boy once more. Murad IV, son of Qasim, a child ruler guided by another mother, but with one difference. The court had learned to fear silence more than chaos. Qasim would rule, yes, but not unseen. And so Halime faded, not into death, but into memory, into a room with barred windows and silver thread carpets, into prayers whispered not for salvation, but for clarity. She had touched power twice. She had placed the crown on a head that could not bear it. She had tried to rule an empire through love, fear, and calculation. But in the end, it was the whispers that ruled. Not her, not him, Not any single soul. Only the murmurs echoing through marble halls louder than drums. The boy had believed he could outrun the system. Osman Tooth was not raised to be a placeholder. From the moment he assumed the throne, he refused to be what others expected. A silent figure draped in brocade, governed by old men and bound by older rules. He was from the start a contradiction. Young yet headstrong, reformist yet royal, ambitious yet unaware of the quiet rules that truly governed the palace. And in his refusal to bow, he began to carve the shape of his own demise. He began with the Janissaries. For centuries they had been both sword and shadow, guardians of the Sultan, enforcers of his will, and yet increasingly the leash that bound him. They had grown fat on bribes, slow in battle, loud in politics. Osman saw them not as protectors, but as rot in the bone of the empire. And so he began to dream of a new army, an elite corps born not in the harem's shadow, but forged in the Anatolian plains, loyal not to tradition, but to reform. It was a noble vision, and a fatal one. The Janissaries heard the whispers, saw the glances in council meetings, counted the coin being diverted from their coffers. They were not scholars, but they understood power. They had bled for this empire, killed for it, and now, at the hands of a boy, they were being dismantled with smiles and subtle cuts. Halime, watching from her diminished corner of court, saw it all unfold. She knew the temperature of the Janissaries better than Osman ever could. She had fed them when others threatened them. She had ruled through them once, and knew how quickly their loyalty soured. Osman mistook boldness for control, but the Janissaries did not respond to vision, they responded to insult. And Osman had insulted them deeply. Then came his pilgrimage, or the promise of one. In 1621, Osman announced his intent to travel to Mecca, a journey of religious devotion that no Ottoman Sultan had attempted in centuries. The court was stunned. Some whispered admiration, others feared assassination. But in truth, the journey was a mask. Osman never intended to complete the Hajj. It was a cover for military movement, a way to escape Constantinople, gather loyal forces in Anatolia, and return with a reformed army, one strong enough to break the Janissary stranglehold once and for all. But empires, like palaces, have ears. The Janissaries learned of his plan before he crossed the Bosphorus. In the pre-dawn dark of May 1622, they moved. Not in formation, not with banners, but with quiet fury. They stormed the palace like wolves long caged, moving through halls with the confidence of men who had built the place. They found Osman in his chambers, half-dressed, reaching for a sword that was not there. He did not cry out. He did not resist. He knew even then that the end had already begun. They dragged him through the streets of his own capital. The people watched, some in horror, others in silence. The Sultan, their caliph, their shadow of God on earth, was pulled like a criminal across cobblestones still wet from spring rain. His robes were torn, his turban knocked loose. He was not yet dead, but he was already gone. They took him to Yedikul Fortress, the Seven Towers, a place that had seen prisoners, traitors, diplomats, and corpses, but never a reigning sultan. And there, in the damp echo of stone, they strangled him, not with a blade. That would have been clean. They used a bowstring, a long-standing tradition meant to avoid the spilling of royal blood. But there was no grace in it, only sound. The thrashing of limbs, the creak of pressure, the quiet gasp of a boy who had dared to rule. When it was over, they left him there. No ceremony, no prayer, no history yet written. Only the body of Osman Tooth, 19 years old, dead by the hands of his own army. The empire reeled. There was no precedent, no plan. The Janissaries had not just killed a sultan, they had shattered the illusion of sanctity. If the caliph himself could be murdered in his sleep, what hope had the rest of them? And in that chaos, Halime rose once more. She did not appear triumphant. She made no speeches. She made no demands. She simply offered a name, Mustafa. It was not forgiveness. It was strategy. The Janissaries, stunned by their own crime, needed a symbol of continuity. They needed to pretend nothing had changed, even as everything had. Mustafa, with his soft voice and vacant eyes, offered them that illusion. And Halime, always watching, offered to make it real. She returned to power not as a mother seeking vengeance, but as a regent offering peace. But inside she burned. Osman had been the boy who displaced her son, the boy who confined her, the boy who ignored the rhythms of the court and thought himself stronger than tradition. Now he was gone, and yet Halime felt no joy, only something colder. Something deeper, something like prophecy, because Osman had not been killed for what he did. He had been killed for what he dared to become. And now Halime stood at the edge of a throne no one truly wanted, placing a crown on the head of a man who could no longer speak his own name. It was not power, it was not victory, it was survival dressed in silk. And yet again, the empire bowed. But this time, the bow was not reverent. It was tired. Mustafa returned to the throne. Halime returned to the halls. The Janissaries returned to their posts, and the people returned to their prayers. But something sacred had been broken. The empire did not know it yet, but it had just crossed a threshold from which it could never return. The second reign of Mustafa I began not with fanfare, but with resignation. The same men who had dragged Osman Tooth to his grave now bowed before the brother he had once displaced. It was not faith in leadership that guided them. It was fear of uncertainty. The Ottoman throne, once a divine seat ordained by Providence, had become a question mark cloaked in gold. And Halime Sultan, with steady hands and an expression carved from stillness, stepped once more into the space where a ruler should have stood. But this time, she no longer bothered with illusion. Mustafa did not rule. He did not command. He did not govern. He wandered. He murmured. He slept for days and woke at odd hours to speak to stars. He asked for people long dead, issued orders to birds outside the window, and occasionally mistook his own reflection for an enemy. The palace knew. The court knew. Even the Janissaries in their sullen watchfulness knew. But none of them spoke, because to name madness is to admit power has no anchor, and if the empire admitted that its sultan was broken, it would also have to admit that its future was too. So Halime ruled. She did so with brutal clarity. Gone was the mother who once wrapped her child in silken prayer. What remained was the architect of survival, a woman who understood that empires do not bend to dreams, only to necessity. She held counsel daily. She listened, weighed, calculated. She answered correspondence, signed decrees in her son's name, negotiated with foreign envoys behind silken partitions. The viziers learned to speak carefully, to submit proposals laced with deference and void of challenge. Her rule was efficient, practical, cold, but efficient does not mean stable. Beyond the palace walls, the provinces stirred. In Anatolia, soldiers muttered of weak leadership. In Baghdad, tribal chiefs questioned the Sultan's authority. In Cairo, whispers from the Mamluk elite began to stretch their limbs once more. And across the empire, taxes arrived late or not at all. The silence that Halime used as a shield began to feel like a vacuum. And power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Worse still, the Janissaries, once her enforcers, grew restless. Their loyalty had never been to her, nor to Mustafa. It was to their own sense of relevance. Under Osman, they had been humiliated. Under Mustafa, they were indulged. But indulgence breeds contempt. The Janissaries had tasted blood, and now they smelled decay. To pacify them, Halime offered coin. She increased stipends, rewarded commanders, turned blind eyes to petty corruption. But bribes are not ballast. They delay collapse. They do not prevent it. And as the Janissaries fattened, the court thinned. Loyal viziers retired early or were dismissed under quiet suspicion. Rumors of poisoning circulated. Spies multiplied. And Mustafa continued to fade. He no longer recognized Halime. When she entered his chamber, he stared as if she were a vision conjured from elsewhere. Sometimes he smiled and called her by the name of a servant long dead. Other times he cowered, whispering verses in reverse as if fending off some invisible punishment. She sat beside him anyway, each night, reading aloud from scriptures, from poems, from anything that might anchor him. But her voice, once steady and certain, began to crack. Because Halime, for all her steel, was still a mother. And mothers do not rule well when their sons are unraveling. Her nights were no longer filled with strategy, but with doubt. She questioned her past decisions, her silence in the early days, her hunger for proximity to power. She wondered if she had crowned a monster or if she had created one, if the cage had broken him or if she had, if her love had been armor or a poison. And still the empire stumbled forward. In the summer of 1622, a rebellion flared in central Anatolia. A preacher, claiming divine visions, declared Mustafa unfit to rule and called for a caliphate separate from the Ottoman line. It began with sermons, grew into rallies, and then into marches. Within months, thousands had gathered behind him. The court dismissed it at first, then panicked. Halime ordered troops deployed. She offered pardons, then threats. She used every lever still within reach, but the machine no longer responded. Even inside the palace, the air thickened with unease. Murat, the young son of Halime Sultan, had begun to appear more frequently in court. He did not speak often, but he watched. He listened. He studied the collapse unfolding around him, like a boy watching a house on fire through a window. Too young to stop it, too old not to understand. And Halime, quiet, calculating, ever present, began to whisper again that the empire needed youth, that it needed vision, that it needed blood untainted by shadow. Halime saw it coming. She had seen the signs before, once as a threat to her son, now as a mirror of her own ascent. The janissaries no longer smiled in her presence. The viziers deferred but did not bow. Reports stopped arriving. Her orders returned unsigned. Doors once opened for her began to creak, stall, resist. She was not being opposed. She was being erased. She clung to routine. She insisted that Mustafa still ruled. She demanded loyalty, cited history, reminded the court of what instability had already cost them. But the empire no longer feared instability. It feared stagnation, and Mustafa was stagnation made flesh. In the final weeks, Halime sat alone more often than not. Her son no longer knew her. The empire no longer needed her. The throne she had fought to preserve sat beneath a man who hummed lullabies to shadows. And yet, she stayed, because to leave would be to admit the truth, that the throne had never truly been hers to protect, that her son had never truly been saved, and that power, no matter how carefully tended, eventually slips through even the most desperate fingers. The palace no longer whispered, it waited. It held its breath like a patient watching its own pulse weaken, knowing that any attempt at revival would only hasten the end. The walls, once alive with secrets and strategy, had grown still. Even the fountain seemed to trickle softer, as if mourning a sovereign no one dared acknowledge had already departed. Mustafa remained on the throne, but it was not a throne anymore. It was a chair, a seat of routine, a cage in the shape of royalty. And the man who sat upon it was no longer a sultan, no longer even a man in the full sense of the word. He moved rarely, spoke less, slept for days, awoke to ask about people who had died decades ago. His voice, when it came, was a dry wind through cracked lips. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he wept, but always it was at things no one else could see. Halime continued to rule in his name, or tried to, but power does not survive in vacuum. It feeds on perception, on theater, on fear. And when the court stopped fearing her, they stopped listening. The viziers stopped sending reports. The janissaries stopped requesting audiences. Even the palace attendants now whispered her name without title, her presence a formality rather than an influence. She still issued orders, but they echoed through the corridors unanswered, the way a widow speaks to a room she cannot leave. She had become a ghost of her own reign. Murat IV, though still a boy, had become a symbol of order, of strength, of potential. He appeared at ceremonies where Mustafa was absent, recited prayers where the Sultan's voice faltered. His presence, though silent, grew heavier each day, until the empire began to tilt toward him without a single proclamation. Halime Sultan, poised and polite, never spoke of succession. She did not need to. Her son's future hung in the air like incense, present in every nod, every deferential glance, every strategic silence. She had learned, as Halime once did, that empires are not taken by force, they are yielded by exhaustion. Halime watched it all. She watched the boy grow into the clothes of a ruler. She watched courtiers who once flattered her now kneel to Kusum. She watched her son lose the last fragments of himself, his fingers twitching at night as if still signing imaginary decrees. And she watched the empire move on, without rage, without guilt, without even nostalgia. There was no coup, no sword drawn. Just a conversation behind a closed door, a few signatures, a sealed decree. And then one morning Mustafa was no longer sultan. The official reason was necessity. The real reason was survival. Halime received the news alone. There were no messengers, no council meetings, only the absence of ceremony, the absence of acknowledgement. Her guards no longer saluted. Her insignia was removed. Her name scratched out of records as if ink itself rejected the memory. Her son was led away, not in chains, but in ritual silence. He did not protest. He did not speak. He followed the eunuchs through halls he no longer recognized, back to the cafes, the golden grave that had once birthed his madness and now welcomed its return like an old friend. He would live another 17 years, but he would never leave those walls again. And Halime faded, not into legend, not into history, but into a mission. She was given chambers far from the heart of the palace, surrounded by attendants who did not know her name or pretended not to. She no longer sat in council. She no longer held sway. Her son no longer spoke. The empire no longer cared. She kept herself occupied with prayers, with reading, with walks through walled gardens that bloomed with flowers she could no longer smell. Sometimes she visited Mustafa. He would sit on a rug, legs folded beneath him, humming to himself, tracing invisible letters on the floor. She would sit beside him and read aloud. Not scripture, not poetry, just memories. The spring we watched the boats along the Golden Horn. The night you first walked. The day you asked if you'd ever be sultan. He never answered, but she kept reading anyway. Because that's what one does when silence becomes the only language left between a mother and her son. Years passed that way. Wars were fought, treaties signed, rulers changed. The empire expanded and contracted like breath. But no one asked about Mustafa. No one spoke of Halime. They had become unpersons, living remnants of a chapter the court preferred to forget. And yet sometimes in the early morning hours, when the palace still slept, a few servants claimed they saw her, sitting by a window watching the first light strike the domes, her eyes sharp not with hope, but with memory, as if she alone still remembered what it had cost to keep the empire whole, not in victory, but in silence. In the years after Mustafa was deposed for the second time, time itself seemed to betray Halime. It no longer marked progress, only erosion. The palace that once buzzed with intrigue moved on with new rulers, new threats, new alliances. Names shifted, allegiances changed, walls were repainted. But no one repainted hers. She still walked those stone corridors, but fewer eyes met hers. Servants bowed out of habit, not reverence. Eunuchs delivered her letters days late. The soft click of her slippers on marble echoed more than it used to. Her presence, once capable of toppling governments, now caused barely a ripple in the stillness of court life. Kusum Sultan reigned through her son now, just as Halime once had. But Kusum did it better, more elegantly. She smiled in public, whispered in council, and moved her son like a chess piece across the empire. Halime watched it unfold, not with jealousy, but with a strange, hollow recognition. She had written that play before. Only now she sat in the audience, unnoticed. Mustafa, locked again in the cafes, drifted even further from the realm of men. He spoke less, responded slower, and often sat for hours watching the same patch of sunlight creep across his chamber wall. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he cried, sometimes he simply stared, as if trying to remember a dream he could no longer describe. He had long stopped calling Halime mother. He no longer called her anything at all. She visited him when she could. She brought sweets he never ate. She told stories he no longer heard. She recited prayers that seemed to vanish into the dust between them. But she kept going, because in the stillness of his gaze she saw her own reflection. Not as she was, but as she had once been. Determined, proud, willful, and afraid. For the first time in her life, she began to wonder if the fear had never left her. If all her schemes, All her manipulations had been born not of power, but of terror, of losing him, of being invisible, of slipping into the silence where so many concubines had vanished without legacy. But the silence had come anyway. It did not arrive like a storm, but like mist. It crept in through the gaps in ceremony, in memory, in documentation. Her name began to disappear from official records. Chroniclers who once noted her every decision now skipped over her entirely. Histories praised Kosum. They praised Murad. Even Osman Tooth, though slain in shame, earned posthumous narratives of bravery and reform. Halime was absent. She had not been exiled. She had not died in disgrace. She had not poisoned or plotted in her final years. She had simply lived. And for the historians of empire, that was the most forgettable crime of all. Eventually, she stopped attending ceremonies. She stopped receiving foreign wives for polite conversation. She stopped being asked to bless births or weddings. She faded, draped not in black, but in irrelevance. Her chambers remained clean, perfumed, dignified, but they were quiet, and in that quiet, she finally faced what she had never dared speak aloud. She had lost, not to Kosum, not to the Janissaries, not to the empire, but to history itself. Because she had gambled everything, her son, her reputation, her soul, for a legacy she would never receive. Mustafa had ruled twice. She had governed an empire in both his names. But when people spoke of that era, they spoke only of madness, of weakness, of instability. No one spoke of her. They did not see the woman who read decrees by candlelight while her son hummed its shadows. They did not see the mother who walked barefoot to the cafes each morning, praying her son might remember her name. They did not see the strategist who preserved the throne not for glory, but to avoid a civil war. They saw only the failed reign, and blamed the mother behind it. She died quietly. No bells rang. No ceremonies were held. A brief notation in the palace registry marked her passing, and then another name filled the line beneath it. Her body was buried in a small tomb within the precincts of the palace gardens, neither grand nor hidden, just there, like she had always been. In the years that followed, the empire would rise again under Murad IV. Kosem would achieve mythic status. The Janissaries would continue to mold sultans like clay until they too became obsolete. The palace would be renovated. New names would cover the walls. New blood would spill across the tiles. And yet sometimes in the cafes, among the stillness, among the caged memories and faded echoes, servants swore they heard an old voice. Not Mustafa's, but a woman's, reading softly, as if history itself was trying to remember what it had chosen to forget. And perhaps in that soundless devotion, Halime Sultan left her truest mark. Not carved into stone, but into the silence that remains when power's gone, when titles are stripped, when the world has turned its back. She did not win. She did not vanish. She endured. And sometimes that is the most dangerous legacy of all.